Welcome to the Raised a Rebel podcast. My name is Katie, and this is my dad, Russell. And today we're going to be talking about the power of words and defining ideologies.
You want to start out with the first one? So we run into labels a lot, right? Especially when it comes to politics. And I'm going to make the argument that some of the labels we're going to use today are evolving as we use them. But to start out with the first one, I know you've got some notes here that you started. Fascism. So tell me about fascism a little bit, Katie.
I kind of did a deep dive into what fascism was a little bit ago. And just to give a straight up definition to start, and then we can kind of dig into that a little bit. The definition of fascism is a populist political philosophy movement or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, that is associated with a centralized government headed by a dictator as the leader, and it is characterized by severe economic and social regimentation and forcible by suppression of opposition. So that's a lot of words. I think just kind of to summarize that is, actually let's jump back. I'm kind of a nerd and I've had to study Latin for school for a while. So here's one thing that helps us kind of understand what fascism was, or is at least what the intent of it was. And so the word itself is derived from the Latin word fascis, which means a bundle of sticks. So the original idea of fascism was that, one twig alone is easily broken, but a whole bundle is almost indestructible. Kind of this, we're all stronger together kind of idea.
So one thing that you caught me in there is you used the word populism. And I wrote that down because I don't think a lot of people understand what a populist movement is. And populism is a focus on the general public, right? It's a movement against the elite of a society. So a populist movement would be a movement derived of the everybody, the middle to lower class. Anybody that isn't considered bourgeoisie or an elite would be populist. And so anytime during these definitions and these labels that we're going to use, and you hear populist, keep in mind that this is a swelling of the masses against the elite. So that class warfare, that class struggle, and we're really going to cover that when we get into communism and the establishment of like the Communist Manifesto, which sets up class warfare. So, all right, go ahead and keep going.
I also think it's interesting that the Merriam-Webster dictionary does define fascism as populist, because in actuality, that's completely opposite of how it plays out, right? So like I said, it's a bundle of sticks. And so the idea is everyone pitches in, we get stuff done better when we stick together, but then the issues start to come when you realize not everyone is able to pitch in the same amount for whatever reason, and then that gets made a little more extreme by politics. That's why, if you look back historically, your fascists were Mussolini, Hitler, pretty much the Nazi party in general. And so that's when you start getting, anyone who doesn't fit the picture of being that ideal person or the perfect twigs ends up kind of being pushed to the side in order to support the better people, better being subjective.
I think you caught up on that with the social regimentation, right? Mm-hmm. Because in a lot of these regimes, you see here's the ideal, and then everything is constructed that's what we should strive for, right? In Nazi Germany, it was the blonde hair, blue-eyed, Austrian, which they're German, but it's kind of funny. But it's that idea of here's what we think everybody should strive for. Mussolini had the same thing. And then the government forcibly prunes off any of those twigs, to use your analogy, that doesn't fit the mold. The idea being trying to force everybody into this ideal construct that represents the strongest, the best,
twigs.
whatever, to try and forcibly constrain society, up to and including elimination of individuals, deportations. The list goes on, including economic. And we talked about that a little bit in here, but severe economic constraints. And that's where you see only certain people can get business licenses. In Germany, you had to have, certain credentials to be able to do business. So you see things come out where they're putting regulation in place so that only the chosen that fit that mold can conduct business, that can, raise families, do everything that they've done.
Well, and from a standpoint of going back to this analogy, the way it gets twisted is, like you said, pruning, but also the idea of, some sticks are bigger than others and stronger than others. And those small ones, their role in contributing to this greater ideal utopian society is just to minimize their drag that they cause to the bigger sticks, to the so-called better people. And so then it's when the government takes that pruning and that minimizing your drag into their own hands that you end up with, I would say, the full effect of fascism, when it becomes not just a ideal of we're all stronger together and ends up being oppress the weak and use it to uplift a very small group of chosen people by the government.
Okay, so I think we need to kind of relate this. What does that look like, fascism in America? It's popular. You hear that dropped on. How do I put this? It's a convenient label to throw on somebody who you don't agree with.
Attack.
It's an ad hominem attack. So what does that look like in America? What are aspects of fascism that relate to America today?
I think a lot of people talk about how late stage capitalism can look a little bit like fascism and communism. I feel like that's just something that's kind of thrown out there a lot, and we'll get to that later in our discussion. But I think the biggest way that it comes out is, like you said, kind of as an insult, because when people hear, oh, you're a fascist or you're a Nazi, they kind of are used interchangeable. It's like that's automatically bad, and no matter what you actually did or what you actually said, people get that in their heads and go, oh, well, you're a Nazi. But the logical breakdown of why that's not a valid thing to jump to is because most of the time it comes down to things like, for example, if you support traditional family values. Well, the Nazis did that. The Nazis supported anyone of their ideal race, getting married, having lots of children. And so because you support traditional family values and Hitler supported traditional family values, you must be a Nazi. Even though, the family unit doesn't necessarily have anything tied to fascism. It's kind of a correlation doesn't equal causation kind of thing that tends to get mixed up. You also see it, people will say that you're a fascist for not being pro-LGBTQ because, again, that was not something that fit into the fascist perfect race.
Which is weird because that label's being used on somebody who doesn't support something that the fascists actively pruned out of society, because in their definition, it wasn't supportive of society, right? So this idea that if you're unable to contribute to society, whether that's disability, whatever reason, right? Pick any of those things out of the bucket, you were pruned from society. And so to be called that because you don't support an ideology is 180 degrees of what any fascism through history has shown. So it's kind of interesting that it comes out that way. I would look at, and it's used as a governmental label, but I would also say it's kind of more of a societal label. We look back at like social media is a good example. When you start choosing who can be represented on social media and who can't, right? And we talk about, censorship is fascism. Well, we have politicians, conservative and liberal, who are banned from platforms because of statements that they've made. Yeah. Is that not a form of fascism? Is that not the overt control? Yeah. And
I mean, I've said this before, and I'll totally say it again because I think it's something that's very vital to keep in mind, is whenever we're talking about any of these ideologies, you have to remind yourself that this is the thing in its most extreme form. And there's always varying degrees of it. And typically, the heart of it and why they got to that was good. Like I said, for this, it was like a we're stronger together type ideal that just didn't play out. And I'm not saying that fascism is good. It's definitely not good. But I like to think of it as like, I don't remember the name of the game, but like the little arcade game where you've got your spikes up here and your spikes down here, and there's the little round bird flying through, and you have to keep it above the stakes on the bottom and below the ones on the top, and it's just bouncing up and down. But if you go too far in any one direction, then it's bad. That's how I see most of these ideologies, but also just as like political systems. It's if you go too far in any one direction, you're going to end up at the extreme, and it's not going to be good. So yes, I do think people are stronger when they work together. I don't think that's too much of a hot take. The issue is I think this is usually the issue when the government tries to take that into their hands instead of letting it be the community coming together on its own.
And I would push back on the government label and say not only a government, but a group.
Yeah.
Because I think there's opportunities through history, and we see it right now collectively in society, where it's not the government that's pushing a populist agenda that's bordering into fascism, but it is that a group or a segment of society is attempting to use fascist idealism to enforce a belief, and across the aisle.
Yeah.
I mean, regardless of political affiliation.
Well, you see it
I see it on both sides.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, let's move into something that gets me all hot and bothered with history is Marxism, yours. Socialism, and Communism.
So I figured we could group these three together in the conversation because one kind of leads into the next. Marxism being the original idea. The definition I have here from Oxford Languages is Marxism is the political and economic theories of Karl Marx, later developed by their followers to form the basis for the theory and practice of communism. And so you have that idea of, again, a utopian state is really what most of these are. And then socialism is like the next step up. Socialism is like easy communism. And when you go to a socialist extreme, that's when you end up with communism.
Okay.
Communism is like the perfect execution of socialism is how I tend to think of it. But I want to hear your thoughts.
So I get into we talk about the Communist Manifesto, right, which is essentially a treatise that Marx and Engels came out with and kind of set forth of here's what defines what communism is. And if I look at my notes on that, right, so it's, heavy taxation for wealth distribution, the abolition of inheritance. Those two kind of go hand in hand. So you tax the rich to support the machine, but then you do away with inheritance so that when somebody dies and passes away, their property, their investments are redistributed amongst the community, for lack of a better term on this one. Along with that goes confiscation of property from immigrants and rebels. So anybody that's opposed to the state for whatever crime you lose your property. So if we look back, communist Soviet Union, if you were an enemy of the state, you lost everything. Anything that you owned, what little you had, was taken by the state. So there's
and distributed to others.
Whoever, right? People in control. And we like to think in our mind, when you hear the communists, come out and say, "Oh, it's for the public good." That's not where that stuff went. The example I looked at was a case of wine, and you're busted against a crime for the state. That case of wine isn't being distributed to your neighbors. It's going to those in political control.
Yeah.
It's almost like, oh, look, it's, the Vikings coming in on a raid and saying,
if you've read
here's
Animal
our plunder.
Farm, this is it.
This is it. Yep. Strong centralized public education. And along with that, the breakdown of a core family. In fact, they did not want mothers in the home. They wanted them out in the fields, in the bakeries. And really it was the ability to raise a family through community, not only community involvement, but almost community permission. And the idea was, as soon as your kids were able to contribute to society, they were put to work for the betterment of society. And so you don't have this core family. You almost have a breakdown into what I would say like skill sets, right? You send your child off to the Baker's Guild and they bake bread. Right, that's their family. They learn that skill, and that's their identity. Class struggle is something that's set forth early in the Communist Manifesto. The idea that you have the workers and you have the bourgeoisie, and essentially, it's this class warfare between them. And it's the working versus the capitalist, that eventually you're going to have a revolution because that's unsustainable.
And it's really interesting that that's such a core belief of Marxism, socialism, and communism, is these class structures, when the whole utopian ideal is, everyone hand in hand, we're all equal.
Well, and that's what I was getting to.
The
entire outcome of it is supposed to be a classless society.
Yeah.
And when you really get into the breakdown of it, if you have a provocateur or an agent of change, right? It's the communist agent is kind of how it's referred to, or that individual contributor that's out there pushing a communist ideal. The agitator is sometimes used. They win no matter what. And here's what I mean by that. If they're able to overthrow society and create this communist, idealism, they win, right? Because now you have what you struggled for. If they fail as an agent or provocateur, the idea is that you have chaos and anarchy, and they still win because it's the overthrow of organized Western society, right? It's all focused on the downfall of capitalism and Western ideology. And so no matter what, the provocateur wins, whether it's a communist ideal or it's anarchy. Either way, they're justified in the outcome because they win.
Which really is, disturbing is the only way I can think to put it, that, the overall goal isn't even for the betterment of the people. It's just for the hate of the current
Western
state,
ideology.
The Western ideology. And I guess I shouldn't say current state, because you're right, it is more Western. One thing that I think is interesting that we should talk about, since this is pretty current, is we recently have had a very communist candidate elected to be mayor
of New York.
New York. So we talked about kind of those ideals that the communists held, and I'd like to read a few of his Zoran's key principles that promises he makes from, this is reading straight off of his campaign website.
Now, keep in mind some of those points I mentioned about the manifesto, and let's see how those align.
Okay. So the first one is freeze the rent. A majority of New Yorkers are tenants, and more than 2 million of them live in rent-stabilized apartments. These homes should be the bedrock of economic security for the city's working class. So freeze rent. People shouldn't have to pay for their housing, right? So
there's a form of taxation and redistribution of wealth, because you have landowners who now can't reinvest or fix those properties. So there's a second level to this, right? A lot of those rent-controlled spaces, and part of what Zoram said in there is if you don't upkeep, you'll lose it to the state.
Yeah.
Right? The state or the city in this
The
in
state
this example
will compensate
will
it
confiscate it
and then distribute it to
the
someone
people.
else.
So here's the thing. You're a renter and you own a place in New York and you've got, 2 apartments and you're going to freeze rent. But the cost of maintenance doesn't go down, right? Construction labor goes up. The plumber
You know
costs
why
more.
that is, though?
Well,
Because
there's a lot of factors to
ultimately,
it.
the
but-
ideal communist state is a moneyless state, right?
Well, sure, but I'm just talking like right now we're in an era of rampant inflation on everything.
Yeah.
And so the plumber's going to cost more, the sheetrock's going to cost more. So if you own these apartments, your cost to maintain them is going up, but you can't raise rent. So what happens? You defer maintenance. You don't maintain them. Yeah. Now the state's going to come in and say, well, you're not maintaining this to a certain level. We're going to confiscate them. And now you've lost it. There's your redistribution.
Yep. So there's the first one. Freeze rent. Fast fare, free buses.
So central transportation, which is another key that I didn't mention in here, but that centralized transportation is a key of the Communist Manifesto as well.
Next one. And this one's not like as like I don't have as many red flags going off. I feel like this is generally something that I would hope a mayor would strive for, but community safety, specifically the Department of Community Safety, and I don't know with New York what all that entails, but I'm typically like, we do want safer communities. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know enough details about what he's structured that as.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely I don't know much about the department itself, but his next thing that he wants to implement is no-cost childcare. Again, making things free.
Yep, and we talked about the public education, state education, sponsored.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it fits right in with that.
We want to take away the children and have them raised up by the community. But when it's raised up by the community, really what it means is raised up by the state,
Yep.
City-owned grocery stores.
Again,
that's pretty
redistribution of
self-explanatory.
wealth, taxation.
Goes back to affordable housing by and for New York. But the first line under that is we need a lot more affordable housing, which I think we totally, for sure, that's something that most elected officials should be striving for, especially in Montana. We have a pretty high property tax, so I feel like that's a pretty normal thing to promise. But having that alongside freeze rent, it's just I feel like there's too many things going away all at once.
Yeah, that's a lot. There's a lot involved with that.
Cracking down on bad landlords. Again, that one's not objectively communist, but I could still see it playing into some of those other things we've talked about. Taxes on big corporations and the wealthiest New Yorkers.
Well, it goes right to the heart of redistribution of wealth.
Yep. And that's all that he has listed, but if you want to look into these more, it's right on his campaign website, Zoran for New York. So I just thought that was interesting to look at, be like, here are the communist values. And again, you can't necessarily point to something and say, oh, well, the communists wanted to, lower the cost of housing. Therefore, lowering the cost of housing must be bad. Not necessarily, right? It's all the other things that are happening alongside that can contribute. Again, you can't go too far in any one direction.
So let's get back to the heart of what communism is. It's and this is straight from Karl Marx, it's advocating for a class war and leads to a society which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. And I think a lot of people get hung up on that according to their needs.
Because who determines their needs and their abilities?
But not the abilities. Everybody leaves out the abilities, right? We hear about the needs.
That's true.
But we don't hear about the abilities. So you want to hit them with your Ronald Reagan quote? This is a great one.
I love Ronald Reagan so much. And he has some great quotes on socialism. Obviously, he dealt with that a lot as president. But the first one, which I love, and I've quoted this so many times, is that socialism only works in two places: heaven, where they don't need it, and hell, where they already have it.
I love it.
And then I have one more too. And I think this really speaks to the whole, the majority of these boil down to this idea of having a utopian state, everyone hand in hand singing, and it's a socialist is someone who has read Lenin and Marx. An anti-socialist is someone who understands Lenin and Marx.
Yep.
Because it's, again, just the utopian idea versus how it plays out in reality, because we live in a fallen world. People will always mess stuff up, and it just, time and time again, history has proven that socialism, communism, and Marxism does not work on Earth, which is what the first quote got to.
So I actually ran across a quote, and I wasn't able to pull it together for the podcast, but it actually talked about, the very first communist provocateur or agent started class warfare and ended up in his own communist paradise. And they're talking about Lucifer on here, that he started class warfare and ended up with his own communist paradise. And, there was a longer quote. It was from the 1940s or 1950s. And it was a discussion at the Communist Party. And I think it was in like New York or Boston. They were actually their party platform right before we saw the big pushback against communism. And it was talking about that as an idealism. So, one of the tenets of communism is, of course, the removal of God, because you can't have your eyes on heaven while you're trying to support your fellow man and build your fellow man. And there's a lot of quotes in there about that. But they held up Lucifer saying, here's an example of this communist provocateur. So
makes me think of reading C.S. Lewis's Screw Tape Letters.
Yep, exactly. So let's get into some capitalism before we run out of time. Yeah. Or do you want to?
I think we should briefly touch on nationalism first.
Okay.
This one's a little tough to define because the dictionary definition is identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations, which I think is interesting. That's not necessarily what I would think of when I hear nationalism being used as an ideology.
So my question on that then is, what's the difference between like nationalism and isolationism? Because, we've had periods of history as the U.S. where we've been more isolationists, right? Higher tariffs, lack of trade, but we're more focused internally versus, this idea of nationalism, which I think, like we've talked before, there's degrees, and it's been bastardized and used as a very poor example.
Yeah, well, and I think there's kind of two aspects of it. There's that support for your country and the love of your country, which I would say patriotism is a synonym, but also the downside of that viewpoint, I guess, is the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations, which is what you're getting at. And I wonder, would like North Korea be considered a nationalist state?
Yes. Yeah. I think so.
Okay.
Well, and we talk about degrees again, but I think most countries at some point are nationalists because it talks about to the detriment of another country. But you won't survive as a country very long if you put all the other countries' needs before your own.
I feel like that's kind of just how people operate also, It's like you're in an airplane, put on your oxygen mask before you help someone else. It's typically how most people operate. So I don't think nationalism is inherently bad. Again, I'm sure pushed to an extreme, you do get something like North Korea that is pretty dang bad. But another way that you hear nationalism is in regards to a specific part of your nation's beliefs, I guess. And I don't know if the same definition even really aligns with this, but you hear like Christian nationalism. And I guess you can have any sort of nationalism you want. You can have liberal nationalism. Well, I had a whole list, but those are the big ones.
I think Christian nationalism comes out because it's a manufactured label.
Yeah.
And it is a manufactured label thrown on anyone who uses their statement of faith specifically Christian, because it's used against Christians, as part of their defining platform, right?
Yeah.
So if you take into account either the abortion debate or really anything that is a personal, social, religious issue, if that comes into the campaign trail in any format, you're labeled as a Christian nationalist. Now, the understanding that label is you're not trying to create a specifically Christian-only nation,
Yeah.
which is what they want you to think. It really is thrown on anybody that says, hey, I'm a Christian. I believe in, God. I believe that abortion is wrong. You start throwing your statements out there. Oh, you're a Christian nationalist. You want to make the entire country a Christian nation.
In reality, what it is everyone's beliefs and, I guess, morality has to boil down to something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for those of us who are brothers and sisters in the faith, that morality boils down to our belief in God, and that's why so many Christians are anti-abortion, pro-family,
Yep.
Well,
and I go back to the founding of the country, and all but 2 of the original colonies had a statement of faith.
Yeah.
And they were general statements of faith, right? I believe in God.
General. That's the key.
2 of them were very specific that they had to be Protestant.
Oh, interesting.
Like very defined statements of faith to hold office within that colony. And so when people say we weren't founded as a Christian nation, it's an outright lie. Yes, there were others involved who were different, as I go, flavors of Christian and deism and stuff like that. Yes. But really, the rights that we derive as a country are looked at as given by God.
Yeah. And
we'd like to think that our rights are given by the government, and everybody's got it backwards. Yeah. The government is there to protect the rights that were ordained by God, not the other way around. And so I know a lot of people like that Christian nationalist label to be thrown out there, and it's dead wrong.
Yeah. I feel like you have a similar thing with separation in church and of church and state that kind of comes out in a similar way, but we can get into that in another episode.
That's a whole other thing that people just do not understand.
Yeah, we'll get into that in another episode. But one more ideology to talk about real quick is capitalism, defined as an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit. So the direct opposite of communism.
Right.
Right.
So what I wanted to get into, and I was going to try and find the quote, but it's interesting because the World Bank has redefined kind of some of the capitalism definitions. And we used to think, if I was to ask you right now, what type of political hierarchy is in China, what would you say? Communism, right? It's not any longer. So the World Bank has started to recognize what we've known as Chinese communism as rebranded state capitalism, because it's...
I was going to get into this too. This is a great train of thought.
Because it's not necessarily communism anymore. It's a capitalist country as one company.
Yeah.
Right. And so they compare and contrast that to what we understand as capitalism is more shareholder or stockholder capitalism, where you have a company with a lot of very small owners and a couple big owners, right? Yeah. Versus Chinese, what they're now saying is state capitalism, where everybody owns it. There's one company, and we talk about this with TikTok, the ownership, and you can't really have a company in China that's not owned by the state, right? They own the majority of most companies, if not all. Yeah. And so they're redefining these labels and things that we've looked at before as capitalist.
Well, and that's kind of silly because, we talked about one aspect of a communist state is that they still do have that highest class, that's your dictators. And I hear this as part of the criticism of capitalism in general is, capitalism at the extreme is that you have potentially your private owners are so few in number that they become the dictators or the class of dictators. But really, I think you kind of nailed it on the head when you talked about how when we say capitalism, what we really mean is like shareholder capitalism.
Pure capitalism, that Western capitalism is entrepreneurship.
Yes.
I'm going to start a company. I'm going to go out and get either investment or whatever mechanism it is to fund it. I'm going to have stockholders where I'm going to represent and create a profit, hire people, pay them a wage.
Well,
Right.
and you know what we call that? The ability to come to a place where you can build yourself up, make a living for yourself. That's the American dream.
Yeah.
Is it not? So, one thing I do think is interesting that we should touch on is, according to recent Gallup polls, most Americans view capitalism, or the percentage of Americans who view capitalism positively is declining, and those who view socialism positively is increasing. So basically, people are starting to like the idea of socialism more than capitalism.
So let's go back to our definition of communism and what Karl Marx said about class struggles.
Yeah.
It's the idea of the elite or the bourgeoisie against the working class. And so now that we're seeing it's coming back up again, right? It's that middle to lower class against the elites. And unfortunately, we're seeing that because we're seeing a bigger disparity between what we used to know traditionally as the middle class and the elite. I mean, it's growing. That gap is widening. You see more and more business owners who are making money hand over fist, and wages are not increasing.
Yeah.
You know, Mom and I we were at the grocery store last night, and we were grabbing burger for dinner. And General Hamburger is now $9 a pound.
So, of course, the idea of a government-run grocery store with low prices is appealing.
Right. And so if we don't think about the long-term impact of, I know the ranchers, you know, in my job, I talk to those guys all the time. Yeah, they're making good money on cattle right now, but it's not at the same rate that we're seeing in the grocery stores.
Yep.
So the slaughterhouses, the JBS Swifts, these large companies are making the majority of those profits.
Mm-hmm.
And guess who owns JBS Swift? A Brazilian company.
Gotcha.
So we're not, you know, we're really down on capitalism in America when a lot of the people that are profiting from our daily lives aren't even American companies. And so when we start getting into that...
So maybe we do need a little bit more nationalism.
Maybe a
little
bit more
which
isolationism.
Actually kind of fits in, because the majority of those people who would say, yes, I would rather be a socialist than a capitalist, are the same people who say, I hate America with everything in me. But when you say, well, where would you want to live? I don't know.
Well, and, you know, I'm a pretty pure capitalist. We talk about degrees.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what would I rather see? Communism? No, I'd rather see a business venture and be involved in something that's going to be successful, that's going to make more money and employ more people than, you know, try and say we're going to overthrow the elite class. Because
capitalism and nationalism also stand out because they're a lot more realistic than the utopian ideals of those other ones.
Yep. I agree. And it's always evolving too. You know, when we start looking at some of these definitions, they're going to shift over time. And we hear a lot about like, well, in late stage capitalism. Well, what is late stage capitalism, right? Because, you know, throughout history, we've always seen kind of a remaking of, you know, industry. And I think you're going to see it right now. The AI field has blown up. And I worked in the AI industry for a couple of years, and seeing where it's come in such a short period, we think it's going to be a boom and bust cycle, right? We're going to hit a point where they're like, well, look at all the advances we've made, but the income is unsustainable for the investment that's been put into it. So you have a lot of people out there that own, you know, OpenAI stock, or they own stock in all these companies, and they're looking for a big, fat, juicy return. Well, if there's not the market for it, it's going to collapse, and everybody's going to be upset. Well, that's the true definition of capitalism, right? It rewards the things that are successful. Yeah. And if you don't have a product or a company that is successful long term, then it's going to weed itself out.
And that's the thing is, when you're in a capitalist state, you yourself control basically your future. I'm sure, like, obviously there are aspects and factors that are totally out of your control, but at the heart of it, you can do something that will have a direct impact in your life and in your welfare. Whereas if you're in any other sort of idealistic state, that's not the case. If you're in a communist state, no matter how hard you work, your welfare is not going to get any better. But in a capitalist state, it can.
It can. There's an open door.
Yep.
There's always an opportunity.
Yep.
So can we finish up with my cows?
Yes.
Because I love these.
Yes.
So we talk about like how to picture what capitalism, communism, and fascism looks like. And one of my favorite illustrations is the cows. And socialism is you have two cows. The government takes one and gives it to your neighbor, right? That's pretty straight up socialism.
Taking your property, giving it away.
Redistribution
to
of
someone else.
wealth. Yep. Communism is you have two cows, you give them to the government, and then the government gives you some milk, right? They're managing it. They're in control of the mechanism of production. Fascism, you have two cows, you give them to the government, and the government sells you some milk, right? So you give up your property for nothing, and then you've got to pay for what you had before. Nazism, which, we kind of talked about, it's a different flavor of fascism. You have two cows, the government takes both and shoots you. Unfortunately, you must have been non-productive worker at that point. And then capitalism, you have two cows, you sell one and buy a bull. And the idea being that you're going to make a business out of it and have more cows. So a lot of isms, a lot of labels, and a lot of misunderstandings.
Yeah. I think this is something really important to talk about, though, because a lot of people hear and sometimes even use these terms, but aren't able to actually define them or know exactly what they are. That's part of the fascism epidemic. Well, everyone's a fascist, but no one knows what a fascist is.
I won't call people out, but my favorite thing is when I see them post on social media, like fascism quotes against like people like us and people that we know, knowing that they absolutely have no clue what the definition is or how they're using it. It was just a popular meme that they saw and they're passing it along. So
I saw one that was about Antifa. It was like, fascists believe all this horrible stuff. Antifa doesn't like fascists. And they're like, see, it's so simple. And you're like, it's really not that simple. And based on what you're saying, it seems like you don't even know what fascism is. So with that, thank you for listening to our podcast.